And we carry on at the State of the Union conference here in Florence and online. And if you are joining us there, do not forget to use the hashtag SOU21. We do want to hear your questions and your comments and your say on what do you think about Europe in a changing world. And here in Florence, we're moving from one topic to another, from geopolitics to strategic autonomy. And as the State of the Union conference marks its 10th anniversary, at the next session, we're going to be discussing the first decade of the European External Action Service. For the session is moderated by Alexander Stubb, the director of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Thanks for joining us virtually. The State of the Union is a big week for us here at the European University Institute in Florence and in Fiesole. And we've kicked off with a really lovely session with the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and the President of the European University Institute, Renaud Dehus, followed by an interesting conversation led by Bridget Laffen on geopolitics. What we'll be doing in the next hour is basically going to the nuts and bolts of European foreign policy. And we're going to talk about the External Action Service. We're going to talk about strategic autonomy. We're going to talk about the modern phase of foreign policy, which isn't really anymore about counting tanks and soldiers and the rest of it. It's much more patchy than that. It's much more different kinds of directions. And to do that, we have three wonderful panelists today. In no particular order, I'd like to introduce Michael Peel, who is the diplomatic correspondent of one of my favorite newspapers in this world, in other words, the Financial Times. I quite often begin my mornings with it. And next we have Stefano Sannini, who is actually an old friend and colleague from the times of Romano Prodi. Currently he is the Secretary General of the External Action Service. And finally we have Daniela Schwarzer, who has just moved on to a new job, and congratulations for that, Executive Director for Europe and Eurasia in the Open Society Foundation. It's lovely to have you here this year virtually and next year physically. What we're going to try to do today is basically to have a dialogue and conversation rather than long lectures. And we'll take it in all kinds of different directions, basically focusing on five themes. The first theme that we're going to discuss is really the big picture of the External Action Service. The personal note here, I am an institutional nerd. I loved to be involved in the negotiations with the Amsterdam Treaty, the Nice Treaty, the Convention, and the Lisbon Treaty as a civil servant. But I was there as foreign minister for the first time when the External Action Service was basically founded 10 years ago in a, you could say, double-hatted hybrid type of a format. So let me pose the first question, and I'll throw it at Stefano, because you're the boss now of the External Action Service. What do you think has been basically the biggest achievement of the External Action Service in its first 10 years of existence, and why? And then also, where do you think things might have been, well, gone a little bit wrong? So Stefano, what are the greatest achievements of the EEAS so far, and warmly welcome.
Thank you very much, Alexander, and good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, as you said. Look, I think that if you look back at what we have managed to achieve in these last 10 years, there are many things that could be said. I think once for all, because it's the one of the most striking is the negotiations in the context of JCPOA, Iran, the nuclear architecture in the Middle East. That's certainly, I mean, it's a very relevant and very visible achievement. But if I can, let's say, go beyond that, I would say that maybe the most relevant element is our presence on the ground. It's our delegations, it's our missions and operations, and what they have managed to become in these 10 years, moving from a let's say, tools to enhance the development cooperation or the trade aspects or the humanitarian assistance into foreign policy actors on the ground, enhancing stability, security, creating the conditions for better cooperation, and so on. So if I have to single out really one of the achievements is the creation of a real network of presence on the ground. What has gone wrong? I mean, many things. I would say that as many things has gone wrong in the world in general. It's not that it's the responsibility of the EEAS, the crisis, the unfolding of crisis, and the fact that we have not managed to solve some of them. But there again, I mean, more than pointing out that, I don't know, Syria or Venezuela, I would point out at the fact that the External Action Service still not yet perceived as the foreign minister of the European Union. We still have to work on the need to generate a perception that this is a service which is working for the European Union, for all the institutions of the European Unions, and it is the face and the image when it comes to the external dimension of the EU. And on that, we still need some work to do, because we need also to make it sure that our main stakeholders, the member states on the one side and the Commission on the other, trust fully the work that we can do for them.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that you're quite often between a rock and a hard place, basically trying to navigate on two fronts. One is between the foreign policies of the 27 member states, and second is try to project it to the rest of the world. But Michael, I mean, you look at this stuff daily. And obviously, you know, coming from the journalist side of things, you make an analysis, you're critical, you point to the deficiencies, to the strong points. I mean, for an outsider, what does it look like? Is the European Union and the External Action Service doing a good job? If so, where? And if they're not, where could they improve? What are your thoughts on this?
Thanks very much, Alex, and thanks for having me. I think I'd try and answer that in a broader way, which is to say, quite a lot of my experience has been outside of Europe, in West Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia, and it's really interesting to compare the presence of the EU politically in these places versus some of the ambitions here, and where there's sometimes a mismatch. And I think sometimes perhaps the EU tries to do too much in too many spheres, so it perhaps needs to be a bit more, the EEAS and other institutions, a bit more disciplined about where it has most leverage, and parts of the world where, for example, the North Korean nuclear dispute, where it really is, whether it likes it or not, a bit player. And Iran is a good example of that, because, you know, as Stefano says, it's a real high point in EU diplomacy, where the EU had a seat at the table as the EU, and as we see now is playing a crucial role in chairing, coordinating the efforts to revive the deal. And I think the other point, the other big picture point I would make is that this question of leverage is something that is obviously still being grappled with in Brussels and member state capitals, and in particular, how to translate economic influence into political sway. And clearly the debate over China is very instructive in that many of the tools that the EU is able to use are tools of the single market and market access, you know, vetting of subsidies of foreign state-owned companies and so forth. And clearly there needs to be more, and things are moving in this direction, but they need to move more in this way, more coordination between the institutions to work out how to present a unified foreign policy through the EU's own institutions. And there are clearly still turf wars and rivalries at the moment that need to be overcome before the EU can do that.
Yeah, let me press you on that a little bit, Michael. I mean, if we look at, you know, we had a previous session here on geopolitics, and if we look at foreign policy per se, Do you not think that the tools of foreign policy are precisely what the European Union has right now? It's about sanctions, it's about trade, it's about competition policy. And in that sense, it does end up having much more leverage, because geopolitics used to be thought about in terms of tanks and military. Now it's something completely different. So do you think this could actually play into the hands of the European Union rather than against it?
Well, I think I would actually make a distinction between the various different points you mentioned there. Trade, competition, policy, absolutely. That's genuine leverage that the EU has because of its economic power. Sanctions are one area which I think is pretty interesting, because and this isn't just a question for the EU, but for other countries as well, that there's always this question of impact. And of course, we've gone through the phase of examining, well, economic sanctions are often questionable at best, a bad idea at worst, because they end up punishing the people of the very countries where the EU and other powers are trying to get rid of dictatorship or whatever. So we've had this move towards targeted sanctions, but how effective are they actually? And Myanmar is perhaps a good example of this. The EU and other powers have imposed sanctions on the Myanmar military and its business interests, but really, I think there's a good case to say these are more symbolic than anything else, because these generals are not people who are traveling to and from Europe, at least not anymore. They don't. There's no evidence that they have great assets within the EU. So there's a question of how much impact that actually has. And then the final point I would make is that even as the EU is embracing these economic tools, it's still looking at the security side, the military side even, and I think the evolution of the European Peace Facility is a good example of that. And for the first time, the EU having the ability to fund lethal weapons and equipment in conflict-prone places around the world, and that obviously raises a lot of questions about the risks associated with that. And I think that's an evolving debate that will need to be carefully watched.
Now, thanks. And Daniela, I mean, you're one of the most respected foreign policy analysts. You've been looking at this stuff basically for the past 20 years. I mean, starting with the High Representative in the form of Javier Solana, then moving on to Cathy Ashton, to Federica Mogherini, and now, of course, to Josep Borrell. I mean, what's your assessment? If you look at the sort of long perspective of the birth of the EEAS, so 10 years before it was there, to the first 10 years, I mean, what are your pros and cons? How do you think they've done it?
Well, my take would be that it's a huge achievement to build an institution of that complexity in a system where it really has to fight for its own role. And this was explained that the EU foreign policy is a very, very complex area of action. So it's about coordinating the 27 foreign policies. It's about making concrete choices. And I think going forward, this has to be done even more, where to weigh in and where to make a difference. And the JCPOA clearly is a very good example where this has worked. But then the world has changed around us. And I think this is really the challenge, not only for the European External Action Service, but for all national foreign policies as well. What you just highlighted, this change of threat perception, it's no longer the hard military threat that prevails, though I think it is still something that Europe should definitely think about, its own military capacity building. However, of course, the foreign policy world has become more complex in the sense that other actors use a very smart combination of economic tools, sanctions were mentioned, of tech, I would say, of foreign policy and defense tools to put pressure on Europe. And Europe, of course, has to respond and also has to think about enhancing its capacity to act more proactively. And so the EEAS sits in the middle of this, but has to make sure that it not only coordinates the foreign policies of the 27 member states, but also plays a role within this EU system in bringing together the different silos where, for instance, sanction policies happen and so on. So I think this is a key task going forward, that the EEAS has to play an even stronger role within the EU decision-making system to bring relevant parties to the same table when other actors approach the EU with a very holistic toolkit. We have to be prepared for that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in the third sort of phase of our conversation today, we'll look a little bit at the intricacies between the Foreign Affairs Council and the European Commission and the sort of constant pressure that the EEAS is under. But before that, let's deal a little bit with the member states. I mean, you've all heard the classic Kissinger question, European foreign policy, that's fine, but who should I call? Very few people know that actually Obama called the European Union. He did it in the middle of the night, forgot the time difference, and he got an answering machine. And the answering machine said, welcome to the European Union foreign policy. If you want the French view, press 1. If you want the German view, press 2, and so on and so forth. So here's the question. Stefano, I mean, you have to deal with this all the time. You have big states with big interests, you have smaller states with smaller interests. How do you coordinate this? Isn't the EEAS in many ways a mission impossible? Basically, everything that goes wrong, you'll get blamed for it. Everything that's good, you know, the Germans are going to take it, the French are going to take it, the Spanish are going to take it. How do you do this?
Well, I mean, I think that if I would think that this was a mission impossible, I would haven't taken this challenge. I think that if you take up a challenge because it means that you can do something, because there is a possibility of doing something. Look, I mean, I think that somehow the foreign policy is not that much different from all the other policies of the European Union. I mean, we have to be clear about one thing. The European Union is made of 27 member states, where there are 27 sovereign governments, parliaments, with their institutions, with their story, with their interests, and we need to reconcile them. So, I mean, in a way, we need to be aware that the process is not always linear and straightforward. But to be frank, I do not see this linearity exist in any place in the world. I mean, you have coalition governments, you have interagencies, coordination that needs to be done. You have regional structures that come into the picture. So, I mean, the complexity this is the complexity of democracy. The only thing that is simple and linear in a decision when decision is taken only by one person, and then we are going into an autocratic system. So we have to accept that what Prodi always used to say, this is the price of democracy, and it's the price that we need to pay it. That said, I think that it is true that it is difficult, but I do not think that it is impossible. We have to be able to reconcile the different interests. You have to be able to, I often say that essentially we have to create the ground on which we are walking. Before going out, we need to make sure that we have the support of the member states on one hand, of the Commission on the other, of the institution, the backing of the European Parliament, and also in a way, I would say more generally, the backing of our civil society. Something that we tend to forget a little bit more because we are so much taken in our interinstitutional play that we tend to forget that in principle we work for our citizens. The complexity is also the result of the complexity that Daniela, Michael, and yourself you were mentioning. You said an expression which is very nice, not only about counting tanks, and it is true. It has become much more difficult. You have to have also the security and the military dimension, and this is something on which the European Union has worked quite a lot, and we are getting to a point, as Michael was saying, where we are having even the possibility of financing lethal weapons with our assistance, which is not insignificant. But it is true that we need to see also much more at the complexity of the threats and of the challenges that we have and opportunities that we have in the world. And then all the other policies that you may come, trade, competition, but also, I don't know, screening investment or migration, artificial intelligence or data management. These are all elements that come into the picture and are an important part also because many of these policies have been weaponized by a number of countries. And so, I mean, we need to look much more at this. And this is why I think that, and that's what I'm trying to work on in these few months in office, to structure the EEAS in a way that is not only looking at the traditional crisis management element, not only looking at the security and defense element, it is also looking at all these other threats and challenges that we have and are coming from completely different places. And there we really need to work together as institutions. We really have to team up. Team Europe, I always say, starts in Brussels, then it moves to the member states.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, because I mean, it is quite self-evident that the line between war and peace today is actually quite blurred. I mean, the way in which you can intimidate or have impact, you know, it's got to do with information war, cyber warfare. It could have to do with energy and the many different tools that sort of drives conflict, if you will. Daniela, because, you know, you've worked German foreign policy for a long time, etc. And there's this old saying that there's no European foreign policy if Germany and France, and I guess in the olden days, the United Kingdom didn't agree. How do you see this? I mean, how strong are Germany and France in terms of a driving force behind European foreign policy? And how would you see the role of the EEAS to try to coordinate all of this?
Well, I think the first point to observe is that in very many issues of foreign policy, Germany and France come from different directions. Not necessarily when you ask them to define their interests, but really then when it comes to the selection of the right means, the question of basically style, foreign policy style, the political culture that lies behind that is very different. And then also the ability to act quickly. As you know, the French system is a presidential system where Emmanuel Macron can move many things. Angela Merkel often has to consult the Bundestag on many moves that the French wouldn't expect a parliament even to play a role in. And so here we have two partners who come from quite different points when it comes to foreign policy. In the EU, I think, you know, over the past years, they have played an important role, not necessarily bringing things to a closure and success, just if you think of the Normandy format and the implementation of the Minsk agreement, the whole Ukraine-Russia issue. However, I do believe if they hadn't taken the initiative after the annexation of Crimea for the EU, I think, you know, we wouldn't have probably moved at all in that way. Secondly, we also observe that other countries become more active. If you look at the case of Belarus and the involvement of the Baltic states, this is remarkable. The initiative they took, in particular Lithuania. And so we can say that depending on the way certain policy issues resonate with individual member states, we see activities there. I think the big challenge is, of course, and here I come to your point on the EEAS, to make sure that coordination happens, not only between the European level and then the national level of those countries that are active, but also to bring on board as many member states, even if it's only passive backing of such smaller groups initiatives. And I think that will really be, in a way, looking ahead, the future that we will have to deal with, because as the world around us moves so quickly and as conflicts erupt more rapidly and the situation can change far more quickly than we might have expected beforehand, I believe that smaller groups of countries moving ahead, but with the backing of the EU and with the support of the EEAS where possible, this is really something that needs to be developed, because the challenge really is in these days to be able to act. And as we know, EU foreign policy is a policy area that is decided upon by unanimity. And very often we have seen decisions taken very late or not taken at all.
Yeah, I mean, again, very dangerous subject for me. I wrote my PhD on differentiated integration. Of course, we already now have the possibility of structured cooperation, but I guess one of the key elements that we should push on here is sort of the delegation. I'll take an example, the situation in Ethiopia. The High Representative has basically delegated it to the Finnish Foreign Minister to represent the European Union in the peace mediation and in the negotiations, and this is a good way of pushing things forward. Now, Michael, given nationality, I can't help to pose this question about sort of member states and unity. We've just been amputated by one member state. You know, the United Kingdom, P5 member, NATO member, nuclear power, foreign policy power. What did this do to the European Union's foreign policy? Are we sort of amputated on that front as well, or how do you see things going forward between the European Union and the United Kingdom vis-a-vis foreign policy?
Thank you, Alex, for that simple question. I think it has made obviously a difference, and of course the old cliche was that, and this was alluded to earlier, that EU foreign policy was kind of a three-legged stool, and apologies, there's an alarm going on in the background here. It was a three-legged stool at root, and you had France, Germany, and the UK taking their positions and created a triangle, and people, other member states would take their positions at some point within that triangle closer to this member state or another. So it clearly has made a difference. The UK has taken the position that it is not interested, at least initially, in structuring a formal post-Brexit foreign policy cooperation, but clearly that is going to evolve over time, and we've already seen examples such as over the Xinjiang sanctions, where the UK did coordinate with the EU and other powers over imposing sanctions, and I think that we are going to see more trends in that direction, because clearly the UK is in Europe, and also many of the challenges that the UK faces are very similar to the challenges that the EU faces in this world of great power competition. So I think the rhetoric from London is of distance and of we will do things by ourselves, but the realities have a habit of intruding, particularly in the world we live in at the moment. And I think that we're going to see more and more sort of cooperation building up in various areas.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. In many ways, we're tied hip to hip, and there's no question about that. That, you know, if we're seeing the emergence of perhaps three power blocks, China, the United States, and the European Union, then the United Kingdom is going to be a key player there, somewhere in between the United States and the European Union. And I'm sure that from the value-based starting point and our basic interests, we are going to be doing stuff together. Now, let's move on to our third theme, which is sort of the institutional structure. And I understand that this is a little bit nerdy, but please, everyone in the audience, bear with us, because there's nothing more interesting than the intricate institutional battles in Brussels. You'll remember that originally the High Representative was sort of placed into the Council format, you know, Javier Solana in the early days, if you will. Then later on, you know, Amsterdam, Nice, the Lisbon Treaty Convention, we ended up basically with a double-hatted persona. So one foot with the Foreign Affairs Council, General Affairs Council, and one foot, of course, in the European Commission. Now, I'd like to sort of move a little bit in the direction of discussing this dilemma. I mean, in many ways, it does reflect what European foreign policy is about. You know, it's partially supranational, partially intergovernmental. But how do you see it, Stefano? You have to deal with it every day. I mean, in many ways, you have two constituents. You have to navigate inside the European Commission and the College of Commissioners with Josep Borrell, and then you have to navigate with the member states. How do you do this? Give us some insights, Stefano.
Well, actually, I was somehow hinting already before. That is to say that when I get up in the morning, I have first of all to create the conditions for me to work, and then I can start working. I mean, essentially, this is the basic point. This is, look, I mean, I don't know if the institutional design has been the right one. You know the story as well as I do, and that was the result. Very often the compromises are offering solutions that are not necessarily the best solution. But here we are, and now we have this structure, which is a sort of balance between the Council and the Commission, between the Member States on one hand and the Commission on the other. And we need to work with her. To me, the only possible answer to this is cooperation, is the ability to show and prove that we can produce results, that we have an added value in all this process, that we are able to work with the other institutions. And so the name of the game is cooperation, cooperation, and more cooperation. The hope is that by doing this, you can convince, let's say, by cooperating, by being a genuine partner, by being, let's say, helpful in the work, that you can create the conditions for being entrusted more in your action and your activities. So to avoid the creation of other structures, which are, how to say, within the Council or within the Commission, are trying to do the work that we should be doing. I'm insisting very much on the point that it's not by chance that we are called a service, in the sense that we are not an institution. We do not have an institutional agenda. So in a sense, we serve the two institutional agendas. And there is something that needs to be recalled, that in the decision establishing the External Action Service, the EEAS is put under the authority of the HRVP, but is also said that he will serve at the same time the President of the Commission and the President of the Council. And that's the ambition to, I would say, to make it, to convince and to make it sure that the both institution, Council and Commission, can count on us, can trust us, that we are not, let's say, for the Council, a way of communitarizing the policies that are in the hands of the Member States, and that for the Commission, we are not, let's say, an instrument to re-governmentalize the policies which are which have been communitized. So it's a question of which is based on trust, it's based on confidence, it's based on connecting, on linking to people, in thinking much more at the outcome, at the product, at the results, and at the added value.
And I think you're absolutely right. And if you look at the sequence of high representatives basically running the European External Action Service, you know, starting from Solana, moving to Ashton, Mogherini, and now to Borrell, I mean, what we're starting to see is, of course, increased international criticism, which I actually think is a good thing, because that means that the European Union counts, that means that the External Action Service counts, and that means that the High Representative counts as well. I've always said it, I mean, it's one of the most difficult jobs that you can have on a European level, because you're trying to coordinate so many things at the same time. And if the audience listening, I mean, pick up on the success stories. The JCPOA negotiations with Iran, of course, is one of them. And this is what the kind of stuff that the European External Action Service always tries to target. How about you, Daniela? I mean, when you look at this, a double-hatted high representative, if I may be completely theoretical, what do you think? Should it have been communitarized, or are you comfortable with the current institutional setup, with basically one foot of the High Representative being in the Council and the other foot being in the European Commission? Is this a good structure, Daniela?
Well, it's less about being comfortable, but being realistic what can happen. And I think Stefano laid out the reasons, or, you know, behind his arguments are the reasons why we didn't move to a more radical communitarized supranational model. And I believe this is not going to happen anytime soon. So we have to work within the system that exists in the best possible way. And here I do think, you know, it's not only looking at the performance of the High Rep and of the EEAS, but it's really also looking at how governments position themselves and whether they pay lip service to the EEAS or whether they actually really support its activities. I think this is something that we have to scrutinize all the time, because the system heavily relies on a cooperative attitude of all member states, and then of course the European institutions that have been set up. And I just want to go back to one point that you mentioned in your comment earlier, Alex, and that was delegating authority to represent the HRVP in certain issue areas. And you mentioned the example of the Finnish Foreign Minister Haavisto on Ethiopia. And I think this is really a model we should think more about, and maybe even expand it, not only to special country representatives, but really think through other multilateral fora where authority can be delegated to individual foreign ministers of the EU member states to act on behalf of the EU. I think that would greatly increase ownership among the member states, and it could really bring more players to that really core discussion that we have to engage in more. How can we make this very complex setting work more efficiently and in a more coordinated and more forward-leaning way? As again, the High Rep and the EEAS can do a lot, but it's really up to the member states to engage more forcefully.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And I remember from the good old days when I was foreign minister as well. And you still have this, of course, special representatives for areas. I mean, Miguel Moratinos actually was the Great Lakes, if I recall correctly, then later became the foreign minister of Spain. And you have Mira Lajčák doing the Balkans at the moment. These are good, I think, confidence-building, trust-building measures, but the idea that you would have a sitting European foreign minister representing the European Union in a particular, it could be a crisis, it could be an international organization, I think that's very good, and it brings sort of the community together. Okay, let's move on, and I'll next poke on Michael. Let's move on and talk a little bit about a geopolitical commission. You'll know that it's one of the three sort of targets of what the European Commission is doing at the moment. I would argue actually doing it quite well. But if we start looking at geopolitics in the 2020s, if you will, and before we move to the concept of strategic autonomy, what in your mind is geopolitics in 2020? How do you define it, Michael? Please help us out.
Well, again, another easy question, Alex. It's become a cliche
because
to
now
say.
I can ask tough questions to a journalist. I really enjoy this.
Exactly. Yeah, the boots on the other foot. I mean, it's become a cliche to talk about a world of great power competition, but it is obviously to a degree true, and that you do have both at a global and a regional level various sort of power struggles going on. And I think that I would say that the most important thing is to look at things on their merits and to perhaps avoid being too glib about both your own kind of abilities and about what you can achieve, and to proceed with both determination and humility, if I can put it that way. Yeah. So to give an example, the approach to China that the EU has taken, famously, it's this three-pronged approach of cooperation, competition, and systemic rivalry. That's coming under a lot of strain, but at its root, it seems to me not a bad starting point of looking at things. That, obviously wars and open conflicts are bad, and one should try to avoid them, and that seems like a fairly good way to look at a dangerous world, and that clearly that policy is evolving, but at root there's a nuance to it which I think is sort of widely seen as a good way to start looking at things as a framework. So that's perhaps an example of how a policy can be set and then evolve as events change, and clearly they're changing in many ways a discouraging direction, but at least there's a platform to build on. Where I think a road that I think is less wise to travel down is the kind of US rhetoric, which to some extent is reflected also in the EU, about democracy promotion and and at the US level explicitly talking about an alliance of democracies. Where I think the risk of that is that you can look hypocritical, because of the record of the US and European powers and their relations with various dictatorial regimes over the years, but also in terms of the partnerships that they're forming now. And it was very noticeable, for example, at the G7 foreign ministers meeting in London, that the representative from ASEAN, the Southeast Asian Nations Organization, was from Brunei, which holds the presidency of ASEAN. Of course, Brunei is ruled by a sultan who has been in power for 53 years and is the world's longest ruling executive leader. So, whatever else one can say, one can't say that Brunei is a country that cries out as being particularly an ally in a push for global democracy. So that's what I mean about avoiding being too glib and showing a bit of humility also in one's approach. And I think that's a very long way of saying that something very simple, which is judge things as they are. Don't be too rigid in your approach, and be prepared to build on moments where you think cooperation is possible, but also to be clear-eyed where countries are not interested in cooperation and where the relationship is necessarily going to be a bit more antagonistic.
Yeah, and I like that approach a lot. I used to, in the olden days, talk about the dignified foreign policy. So basically, take things at face value and don't believe that you can force change. You can force change by way of example and showing what you do that works. And that's why I like the way in which you put it. You have to have humility at the same time, determination. But how do you, Stefano, how do you do this? I mean, you are probably going to get accused that you're not tough enough with China on human rights, or you're going to be accused that you're too soft on China. Or you're going to be accused of saying, why did you go ahead and push through the investment agreement with China? Or on the other side, they say, why didn't you wait for the United States? So, I mean, how do you find this balance? Because at the end of the day, it's really about your approach to foreign policy. Do you believe that it should be done by stealth and force, as was actually done post-Cold War in Iraq, Afghanistan, if you will, or should we just be a little bit more humble in what we do? How do you navigate your way through this, Stefano? Another easy question, right?
Well, I mean, it's you made the question, you gave also an answer, because you were speaking about Afghanistan. So if I have to think about, let's say, being able to force things through stealth, not a very good example from that point of view. So it's sad to say this, because I think that this is not something good. In a way, the threat of the use of force has always been one key element in the projection of power. And once you're depleting this capital, it's a very problematic moment. That said, I think that it was very nicely put by Michael. What is happening, what we are all doing in a way. Yeah? It's the you have in front of you, and you speak about humility, or you speak about honesty, and I think that that's something that we have to say. I mean, there are limits to how much we can force changes, because the ultimate point of forcing changes is the use of force. And again, then we go back to the original point. But there are, between doing nothing and the use of force, there are a number of elements that can be done. Sometimes you can do it by expressing your unsatisfaction. We've spoken about sanctions at the beginning. Sanctions, we always say that is a means to an end, not an end in itself. And we should keep this in mind when we use this instrument, and we are using, let's say, quite abundantly in this last few years. You have to be able to define which is the perimeter of your security and how you can defend it. You need to be able to, let's say, to put economic pressure. You need to be able to put, let's say, political pressure. Sometimes you can even try diplomacy. Yeah? From time to time it works. It's not it's something that you can do. But I think that what Michael was recalling, let's say the view of China as a partner, as a competitor, and as a rival, can be maybe applied also to other cases and other realities, where you have at the same time, let's say, counterparts that are filling the three cases, the three boxes. There are other cases where they're filling just a couple of them. And so you have to be flexible and pragmatic enough in using all the instruments that you have at your disposal in order to, let's say, try to get the maximum benefit out of it. In doing this, you have to be clear about what you want to achieve, which are your interests, and also between the interests, I also put the defense of values. I think that the partition between interests and values is not always let's say, valid from as to things that are different between themselves. And then you have to be you have a toolbox, and in the toolbox you have to choose which are the things that can be more effective in a certain occasion. But we also need to be aware of which are the limits of what can we achieve. And again, I mean, I still remember our common friend of ours, which was Carl Bildt, when he was appointed High Representative for the implementation of the peace accords in Bosnia-Herzegovina, that was saying that I cannot bomb Serbs into friendship, Bosniaks into friendships, in the sense that you need to create also certain conditions. Sometimes it takes time. So you have to have also the humility to understand that you cannot change all the things overnight. But again, there are many things can be done between going at war and doing nothing.
Great, thanks. Now let's move into the discussion about the slight elephant in the room, strategic autonomy. Those with sharp eyes might have noticed, by the way, that under the title of Daniela, you still see her old job, in other words, the German Council of Foreign Relations. But as you will know, she is now working for the Open Society Foundation. Daniela, please define strategic autonomy to me. I can't understand it. For some, it's protectionism. For other one, it's sort of taking care of yourself. What is this strategic autonomy stuff? I mean, we saw it for the first time in the Foreign Affairs Council conclusions, I think roughly around 2013. How do you analyze strategic autonomy? Please help us out.
Well, first of all, I'll try and start with a definition, as you've asked me for one. I would say it is the capacity, in this case of the EU, because the EU is seeking strategic autonomy, to be able to make its own independent decisions on matters of foreign policy, but in that very broad sense, as we have just discussed it. And then also, of course, it needs to have the means to follow through. So this is a real work program for the EU. It's nothing you can just wish for and then have it, but you have to establish yourself as an actor who actually is able to take strategically autonomous decisions. Now, the term has really polarized, not only within the European Union, but also across the Atlantic, because some indeed interpreted this idea as Europe turning away from its main ally, the United States. And of course, as the term, you mentioned it, it is far older than the debate that really came to full power when Donald Trump was president, and the Europeans were thinking about their obvious inability on some key issues to actually act according to their interests and their defined strategy. And the JCPOA, which we mentioned today as a great success, in that case really was the example that when the US left the JCPOA, the Europeans had great problems in actually following through because they wanted to stick to the agreement. And now today, this term strategic autonomy, it comes, I would say the debate comes with different headlines from different corners of Europe. Some would want to call it European sovereignty. Others think both terms are far too big and too polarizing, so let's just call it capacity to act. which I think is a very workable definition, because it obliges you to really think through what would prevent us from acting. And here we come back to the politics. Of course, the first thing is you have to make a decision that you actually want to act. So we come back to the whole question of, is it the EU 27? Can consensus be forged? Or will it be smaller groups acting, or individual representatives acting on behalf of the EU? Or may it even be EU countries acting without the backing of the EU, which is definitely not a good case. But then once you know what you want to do, how do you get there? And here we come to the portfolio discussion. Do we need to invest more in defense? Do we need to strengthen our other capacities? And I do believe this is really what we need to look into today in a very realistic way.
Yeah, no, I really like that definition, capacity to act, because it's sort of probably more neutral than strategic autonomy, let alone strategic sovereignty, and it doesn't incite that much, how would I say, emotion. But it does remind me of the debate, we had about differentiated integration in the 1990s and early 2000s. It was about a la carte, variable geometry, it was about multi-speed and the rest of it, and just the sort of how does the congestion of terminology made it all quite complex. Now, Stefano, I know that the European Council for Foreign Relations, Mark Leonard, did a paper for you guys about 2 years back about strategic autonomy. Things have moved on since. We've seen a good paper coming from Natalie Tocchi here in Italy on strategic autonomy. How do you see it? How do you define it? And I know you're probably going to have to be very careful in your definition because it's a council conclusion related, but how do you define strategic autonomy before I move to Michael?
Well, not too much. I think we have managed to come to a quite clear agreement in the council about how to define the strategic autonomy, which is the capacity to act together whenever it is possible and alone whenever it is. And it's I think it's a good way of describing the situation, and maybe adding this element to of the cooperation to the one that Daniela was mentioning before. I would add that in the Brussels jargon, we tend to qualify strategic autonomy as open strategic autonomy, and that covers, and that's you take it then to come to your remarks, Alex. I think the two main preoccupations are essentially, do we want to be strategic autonomous? Does it mean that then we are leaving the United States or we're leaving NATO? Or do we want to have strategic autonomy and hence create problems to the freedom of the market, to our liberal vision about the market? So the ways how to assuage these two preoccupations, because then at the end of the day, on the rest, there is a quite substantial degree of agreement and of understanding about the need to make the European Union stronger in order to be stronger in the partnership. And I mean, and that's also very much the way we are trying to engage with all the partners of the European Union, saying that it's in the interest of everybody to have strong partners working for a strong partnership. The point, I mean, again, after having had a quite substantial discussion on the concept and the conceptualization, now fortunately the discussion has moved much more into the more concrete elements. So what do we need to do in order to increase our capacity to act, to take up the definition, Daniela, to say which are the things that are missing in order to be able to act. And that is not only about the defense, let's be clear, it's much broader than that in terms of concept, because for example, we have seen in health sector, one of the problems that we were having was the production of vaccines. And that's the quite substantial preoccupation that we have had for some time. So it's the idea we have to, once that we go out of this more ideological discussion and you focus on the things that need to be done, then you can have a realistic sort of check of the activity that you need to develop in order to become let's say, able to act and to react and to, let's say, protect without becoming protectionist your own societies. Another example, going into the area of trade, is about, for example, the screening of investments. That's another area where we have decided that we did not want to have, let's say, investments that could endanger the security of our society. And that's something that in the past maybe we could have seen as a sort of anathema, but today it's part of our toolbox. Maybe what we need to do is to rethink the idea of the overall globalization, both when it comes to security and when it comes to the economy. So it's the idea of the global value chain as the idea of the global security element.
Okay, excellent, Stefano. I'm going to pose one question to Michael before I go to the final question about the future of the EEAS, where I would like for you to give me 3 points of where the EEAS should be in 10 years. But before that, I go to one of the questions that we got from the public, which is a good bridge from what you just said, Stefano. The question comes from Mark Dempsey, and he asked, strategic autonomy could have been demonstrated by the EU taking the lead on waivers on IP protections. They, of course, didn't show any indications towards this until the US led the way. Would be interesting to hear your thoughts here. And Michael, I'll throw this to you, and I do remind you that, as a matter of fact, President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, this morning here at the EUI, at the State of the Union address, opened the door for this. What are your thoughts on this type of strategic autonomy?
Well, I think it's very welcome that the European Commission President has indicated a willingness to get into talks about this, because this is a complex area, but I think a problem has been a sense that major Western powers, including the US and the EU and the UK, have been reluctant even to engage with this. So it's great to finally have that discussion. But I would say that in a way, using this as an example kind of shows the problems with the whole strategic autonomy debate, in that for me, and perhaps Stefano was hinting at this in a more diplomatic way, that it risks becoming a massive distraction, because for two reasons. Number one, so many of the problems like this one are not problems where countries can act autonomously. The pandemic has shown that. The patent argument is something that flows from that. Climate change is another example of where nations, even regions on their own, are not going to have an impact. It's the very opposite, perhaps, of the whole sort of drive for autonomy. And the second point is, rather than highfalutin debates about what the term strategic autonomy means, it's really important to do, as Stefano said, the concrete stuff. And I think a really interesting example of that is the new industrial strategy out this week, which looks in concrete terms at materials and products from diamonds to turbo propeller engines, where the EU has an import dependency on a very small number of countries, and that it needs to find ways to reduce that dependency. Now, that's coming from the Commission, that strategy, but it clearly is also a massive foreign policy question, and that shows again the need to get the EU foreign policy to be much more integrated between the different institutions.
Excellent. Now, given that we only have 2 minutes left, I'm going to redefine my question and ask you to give 1 point where the European External Action Service should have succeeded in the next 10 years. So if you had a wish, what did the EEAS do 10 years from now? What would be that one thing? Stefano, you go ahead and start.
Well, I hinted at the beginning, making the EEAS, now I have to be careful about the words, because if I say the EEAS becoming the foreign minister of the European Union, we have a feeling that we are creating the 28th foreign minister or the additional director general of the Commission, which is not the case. In order to understand what I want to say, I think what Michael has just said is very relevant. It is to say the foreign policy has become something much more complex and articulate, and we have said this all around this discussion. It covers many, many different elements, and we have to have the capacity to bring them together. The External Action Service should not replace the Commission, should not replace the foreign policy, but should be able to bring together all these different elements and to generate a much greater coherence in the activity that we are doing.
Very good. You can all see that Stefano is a fantastic diplomat. This is why he's leading the EEAS. Next, Daniela, in 10 years, where should we be?
Well, my wish would go pretty much in the same direction. The task the HRVP has, as put down in the EU treaties, is to ensure the consistency of the EU's foreign policy. And as we have established over the past hour, there are many reasons why it's very, very difficult to ensure that consistency. So in my hope, I would see a EU foreign policy led by the HRVP, supported by the EEAS, that is consistent across policy areas, but also across member states. So that idea of support, of political buy-in, and of delegation of power to individuals representing the EU is really something we have to work on.
So number one, bring together. Number two, ensure consistency. Michael, the final say.
To show that the EU and its member states are prepared to reckon with their pasts, acknowledge the mistakes and contradictions of the present, and to play a progressive role in the world in the future.
I think that's a wonderful way to end it all up. And let me tell you that I think European foreign policy, including the EEAS, always works through three phases. Phase number one is crisis. Phase number two is chaos. And phase number three is suboptimal solution. With these words, remember, we're not talking about a utopian diplomatic service. We're talking about the External Action Service of the European Union. Thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you for following us.
Thank you.